Picture this. You're standing outside one of the world's most famous palaces, camera in hand, ready to capture the perfect vacation photo. The sun is shining, tourists are laughing, and those iconic guards in their red uniforms stand perfectly still like living statues. It seems like harmless fun to get a little closer, maybe pose for a funny picture. What could possibly go wrong? But sometimes, a single moment of poor judgment can turn an ordinary tourist into an international headline. Sometimes, crossing an invisible line doesn't just mean an awkward encounter. It means facing consequences that will follow you for the rest of your life. This is the true story of Marcus Henderson, a 28-year-old marketing executive from Denver, Colorado, whose London vacation became a nightmare that shocked the world. What started as an innocent attempt at a memorable photo ended up teaching everyone a harsh lesson about respect, boundaries, and the serious consequences of pushing too far. You're about to discover what really happens when someone decides to test the limits with one of the world's most disciplined military units. This isn't just another tourist mishap. This is a story that will make you think twice about everything you thought you knew about those silent sentries who guard our most sacred institutions. The truth is stranger than fiction, and sometimes reality delivers lessons that no guidebook could ever prepare you for. The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestones of Horse Guards Parade as Marcus Henderson stepped off the red double-decker bus, his brand-new Canon camera hanging around his neck like a badge of American tourism. He had been planning this London vacation for 2 years, saving every penny from his marketing job in Denver to make the trip of a lifetime. At 28, Marcus considered himself worldly enough, but this was his first time outside the United States, and everything felt electric with possibility. "Honey, make sure you get pictures of everything," his girlfriend Sarah had said before he left. "I want to see it all when you get back." Marcus had promised he would document every moment, every sight, every experience that London had to offer. He had already filled 2 memory cards at Westminster Abbey and the Tower of London, but nothing could have prepared him for the spectacle that awaited him at the Household Cavalry Museum. The Horse Guards building stood like a fortress of British tradition, its weathered stone walls telling stories of centuries past. Marcus had read about this place in his guidebooks, but seeing it in person took his breath away. The architecture spoke of power, history, and an unshakable sense of duty that had endured through world wars, political upheavals, and the changing tides of modern society. What captured his attention immediately were the guards themselves. 2 mounted sentries sat motionless on their magnificent black horses, their red tunics blazing against the gray morning sky. Their faces were hidden beneath the distinctive plumed helmets, but their posture spoke of absolute discipline and unwavering focus. These were not actors or performers. These were real soldiers of the Household Cavalry, men who had served in Afghanistan, Iraq, and other theaters of conflict around the world. Marcus had always been fascinated by military discipline. His grandfather had been a Navy veteran, and growing up hearing stories of honor and duty had left a deep impression on him. But this was different. This was witnessing living history, a tradition that stretched back over 3 centuries. The guards sat so still they seemed carved from stone, their breathing the only sign they were human at all. Other tourists gathered around, keeping a respectful distance as they snapped photos and whispered in various languages. A group of Japanese visitors bowed politely before taking their pictures. A family from Germany quietly explained to their children about the importance of showing respect. Even the most excited tourists seemed to understand instinctively that this was a place where certain boundaries existed. But Marcus felt different. Maybe it was the excitement of being in London for the first time. Maybe it was the adrenaline of experiencing something so quintessentially British. Or perhaps it was the marketing professional in him, always looking for the perfect shot, the image that would tell the complete story. Whatever the reason, he found himself studying the guards with an intensity that went beyond casual observation. The guard on the left sat atop a massive black gelding named Wellington, a horse that had served the regiment for 7 years. The animal's coat gleamed like polished obsidian, its muscles rippling beneath the surface as it maintained its perfectly still position. The guard himself was Lance Corporal James Mitchell, 25 years old, a veteran of 2 tours in Afghanistan who took his ceremonial duties as seriously as he had taken combat operations in Helmand Province. Marcus did not know these details, of course. To him, the guard was simply a fascinating figure in an elaborate costume, part of the tourist experience he had paid good money to enjoy. He began taking photos from different angles, moving gradually closer as he searched for the perfect composition. The morning light was perfect, casting dramatic shadows that would make for stunning images to share on social media back home. As he moved closer, Marcus noticed small details that the guidebooks had not mentioned. The guard's white gloves were immaculate, not a speck of dirt or wear visible. The brass buttons on his red tunic caught the sunlight like small mirrors. The ceremonial sword at his side was obviously real, its polished steel reflecting the morning sky. Every element of the uniform spoke of meticulous attention to detail, of a tradition maintained through generations of dedicated service. The horse, too, was a marvel of training and discipline. Despite the growing crowd of tourists, the constant clicking of cameras, and the general bustle of central London just meters away, Wellington stood like a statue. His ears occasionally flicked forward or back, the only movement that betrayed his living nature. Marcus had grown up around horses on his uncle's ranch in Colorado, and he recognized the incredible level of training required to achieve such composure. What Marcus did not realize was that Lance Corporal Mitchell was acutely aware of every movement around him. Despite appearing to stare straight ahead into the distance, Mitchell's peripheral vision caught every tourist who stepped too close, every hand that moved too quickly, every potential threat to the security of the area. This was not just ceremonial duty. This was active security work, protecting one of the most important government buildings in the United Kingdom. The morning progressed peacefully enough. Tourists came and went in waves, following the rhythm of tour bus schedules and guided group itineraries. Marcus found himself staying longer than most, captivated by the silent drama playing out before him. He had originally planned to spend 30 minutes at Horse Guards before moving on to Buckingham Palace, but something about the scene held him transfixed. A tour guide with a group of American college students paused nearby, explaining the significance of the household cavalry. "These guards are real soldiers," the guide emphasized, her voice carrying clearly across the courtyard. "They have served in combat zones around the world. This is not a performance. This is active military duty. The horses are also working animals, trained to respond to threats and unusual situations. Please maintain a respectful distance, and remember that you are witnessing a tradition that dates back to 1660. Marcus listened with half an ear, but his attention was primarily focused on his camera and the images he was capturing. He had already taken nearly 100 photos, but he was searching for something special, something that would truly capture the essence of what he was experiencing. The standard tourist shots were fine, but he wanted something memorable, something that would make people back home truly understand the majesty of what he was witnessing. The idea began forming gradually in his mind. Most tourists were content to photograph the guards from a distance, but what if he could get closer? What if he could capture the details that others missed? The texture of the uniform, the individual whiskers on the horse's muzzle, the human element behind the ceremonial facade. His marketing background had taught him that the best campaigns were the ones that showed people something they had never seen before. As the morning wore on, Marcus noticed that the guards occasionally shifted slightly in their saddles, a barely perceptible movement that maintained circulation during their long vigil. He watched Lance Corporal Mitchell's hands, noting how they maintained a light but secure grip on the reins despite remaining motionless for extended periods. These small observations fascinated him, and he found himself wanting to document every aspect of what he was witnessing. The boundaries were clearly marked, though not with ropes or barriers. There was an invisible line that experienced tourists seemed to recognize instinctively, a space around the guards that remained consistently clear despite the crowds. Marcus had noticed this pattern, but his analytical mind began to question whether these boundaries were actual rules or merely customs based on politeness and tradition. A security camera mounted on the building tracked slowly across the courtyard, and Marcus wondered what the guards would do if someone actually crossed that invisible line. The guidebooks mentioned that the guards would respond to interference, but they provided no details about what that response might entail. His curiosity was becoming stronger than his caution, and the combination of jet lag, excitement, and the adrenaline of being in such an iconic location was affecting his judgment in ways he did not yet realize. By noon, the character of the crowd had changed. The morning tour groups had moved on to their next destinations, replaced by individual tourists and smaller groups with more flexible schedules. The atmosphere became more relaxed, and Marcus felt increasingly comfortable in his surroundings. He had been taking photos for 3 hours now, and both guards had remained absolutely motionless throughout. Their discipline was impressive, but it also made them seem less human and more like very elaborate statues. This perception would prove to be a dangerous mistake. Lance Corporal Mitchell was not a statue or a tourist attraction. He was a highly trained soldier performing a duty that he took with deadly seriousness. His stillness was not passivity. It was the focused concentration of a professional who understood that his role represented something much larger than himself. The trap was being set, though neither man realized it yet. Marcus, emboldened by hours of uneventful photography and convinced that the guards were essentially decorative, began to consider how he might capture the truly unique image he was seeking. Meanwhile, Lance Corporal Mitchell continued his vigil, unaware that his discipline and professionalism were being misinterpreted by someone who was about to make a decision that would change both their lives forever. The stage was set for a confrontation that would remind the world why certain traditions deserve respect, and why crossing certain lines carries consequences that no amount of ignorance or good intentions can excuse. Marcus Henderson was about to learn a lesson in humility that he would never forget, while Lance Corporal Mitchell was about to demonstrate why the household cavalry has maintained its reputation for unwavering duty for over 3 centuries. The afternoon sun climbed higher, casting shorter shadows across the ancient stones, and the moment of reckoning drew inexorably closer. The decision that would change everything came to Marcus during lunch. He had purchased a sandwich from a nearby vendor and found a bench where he could eat while continuing to observe the guards. The midday crowd was smaller and more relaxed, with families allowing their children to play nearby while parents took photos. The atmosphere felt almost casual, and this contributed to Marcus's growing sense that the formal boundaries he had observed earlier might be more flexible than he had initially thought. As he ate his sandwich, Marcus reviewed the photos he had taken that morning on his camera's LCD screen. They were good shots, technically sound and well composed, but they lacked the intimacy and drama he was hoping to achieve. Every image looked essentially the same as thousands of other tourist photos taken from the same respectful distance. He needed something different, something that would truly capture the experience of being in the presence of these legendary guards. The idea that had been forming in his mind all morning finally crystallized into a plan. What if he could somehow get close enough to capture the human details that made these guards real people rather than living statues? The texture of the uniform fabric, the individual hairs of the horse's mane, perhaps even a reflection in the guard's polished boots that would show the world from his perspective? These were the kinds of intimate details that would transform ordinary tourist photos into something extraordinary. Marcus began to rationalize his growing desire to cross the invisible boundary that separated tourists from guards. After all, he reasoned, he was not some rowdy troublemaker looking to cause problems. He was a respectful visitor with a genuine appreciation for what he was witnessing. His intentions were purely photographic, and he had no desire to actually disturb or disrespect the guards. Surely a brief moment closer to his subject would be understood and tolerated, especially given his obvious reverence for the tradition he was documenting. What Marcus failed to understand was that Lance Corporal Mitchell's training had prepared him to respond to intentions, not actions. A potential threat was a potential threat, regardless of the motivation behind it. The guard's responsibility was to maintain the dignity and security of his post, and that responsibility did not allow for exceptions based on tourist enthusiasm or photographic ambition. After finishing his lunch, Marcus returned to his position near the guards, but this time his observation was more purposeful. He studied the patterns of movement around the courtyard, noting when security personnel were visible and when they seemed occupied with other duties. He watched how other tourists behaved, looking for any sign that someone else had successfully approached the guards more closely than the apparent norm. What he saw reinforced his growing confidence that the boundaries were more social convention than strict rule. Children occasionally wandered closer to the horses before being gently guided back by their parents. An elderly woman had approached to within about 10 feet while struggling with her camera, and nothing dramatic had occurred. If anything, the guards seemed to tolerate these minor boundary transgressions with patient professionalism. This observation was both accurate and completely misleading. Lance Corporal Mitchell and his partner did indeed show remarkable patience with innocent mistakes and minor boundary crossings. Children who wandered too close were ignored unless they actually attempted to touch the horses. Tourists who momentarily stepped closer while struggling with cameras or maps were given reasonable leeway. But this tolerance was not permission. It was professional judgment, the ability to distinguish between harmless mistakes and deliberate challenges to their authority. Marcus's biggest mistake was assuming that his planned approach would fall into the first category rather than the second. In his mind, he was simply an enthusiastic photographer seeking a better angle. He failed to consider how his actions would be perceived by a trained soldier whose job was to assess and respond to potential threats in real time. The afternoon brought a steady stream of new tourists, and Marcus found himself studying their behavior as much as the guards themselves. He noticed that most people seemed to follow an unspoken protocol: approach slowly, maintain a respectful distance, take photos quietly, and move on without lingering. But he also noticed that this protocol varied slightly from person to person, and that the guards' responses were remarkably consistent. They remained motionless and apparently unaware of the activity around them. This consistency began to work against Marcus's better judgment. If the guards were truly as unresponsive as they appeared, then perhaps his plan was less risky than he had initially thought. After all, what was the worst that could happen? He would be asked to step back, perhaps scolded by a security guard, and the incident would be forgotten within minutes. The potential reward, truly unique photographs that would amaze his friends and provide lasting memories of his London adventure, seemed to outweigh the minimal risk. By 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Marcus had convinced himself that his plan was not only acceptable, but actually respectful. He would approach slowly and obviously, making no sudden movements that could be interpreted as threatening. He would take his photos quickly and efficiently, then retreat to a respectful distance immediately. The whole interaction would last perhaps 30 seconds at most, barely long enough to register as a disturbance. He spent another hour refining his approach, studying the angle of the afternoon light, and planning his shots. He wanted to capture the guard's profile with the late-day sun highlighting the details of his uniform. He envisioned a close-up of the horse's eye, showing the intelligence and training that allowed such a magnificent animal to remain so perfectly still amid the chaos of central London. These images would tell a story that distant photographs could never convey. What Marcus did not know was that Lance Corporal Mitchell had been aware of his extended presence for hours. While maintaining his motionless vigil, the guard had noticed the American tourist with the large camera who had been lingering far longer than typical visitors. Mitchell's peripheral vision had caught Marcus's repeated movements around the perimeter, his obvious photography of the guards from multiple angles, and his general pattern of behavior that suggested more than casual tourist interest. This awareness did not concern Mitchell initially. Enthusiastic photographers were common, and most eventually satisfied their curiosity and moved on to their next destination. But Marcus's persistence had begun to register as unusual, and when combined with his increasingly focused observation of the guards themselves rather than the surrounding architecture, it had earned him a place in Mitchell's mental catalog of persons requiring ongoing attention. The military training that had kept Mitchell alive during 2 combat deployments included the ability to assess potential threats while maintaining operational posture. He could track multiple individuals simultaneously while appearing completely oblivious to his surroundings. Marcus's growing confidence that he was unobserved was based on a fundamental misunderstanding of the professional skills he was attempting to challenge. At 4 o'clock, Marcus made his final preparations. He checked his camera settings, ensuring that he would be ready to capture his shots quickly and efficiently. He reviewed his planned route, identifying the optimal position for his photographs and the quickest path back to a safe distance. He even rehearsed his explanation, planning how he would apologetically explain his actions if questioned by security personnel. The fatal flaw in his planning was the assumption that he would have time to explain himself. Marcus was thinking like a tourist who might be gently corrected by a museum guard or park ranger. He was not thinking like someone who was about to challenge a combat veteran whose training emphasized immediate response to potential security threats. As the late afternoon crowd began to thin, Marcus saw his opportunity. A tour group had just departed, leaving the immediate area around the guards relatively empty. The lighting was perfect for the dramatic shots he envisioned. Security personnel were visible, but appeared occupied with other duties. If he was going to act on his plan, this was the ideal moment. Taking a deep breath, Marcus shouldered his camera and began walking slowly toward Lance Corporal Mitchell and his horse. His approach was deliberate but non-threatening, the measured pace of someone who believed he was engaging in a reasonable activity that might push boundaries but would ultimately be understood and forgiven. With each step, Marcus felt his excitement building. He was about to capture photographs that no guidebook featured, images that would provide a unique perspective on one of London's most iconic traditions. The historical significance of the moment was not lost on him. He was documenting living history, preserving a moment in time that represented centuries of British military tradition. Lance Corporal Mitchell's awareness of the approaching tourist shifted from passive observation to active assessment. The American's direct approach, combined with his extended loitering and obvious focus on the guards themselves, triggered training protocols that had been drilled into Mitchell through countless hours of instruction. This was no longer a tourist who might accidentally wander too close. This was an individual deliberately approaching a secured position with unknown intent. The horse Wellington sensed the subtle change in his rider's tension. 7 years of military service had taught the gelding to respond to minute signals from his handlers, and he felt Mitchell's slight shift in posture that indicated increased alertness. The horse's ears moved forward, tracking the approaching figure with the kind of attention that suggested preparation for action rather than passive observation. Marcus reached the point of no return when he crossed an invisible line approximately 15 feet from the guard. This was the distance that Mitchell's training had established as the threshold between tourist curiosity and potential security threat. Beyond this point, any civilian who continued to approach would be considered a deliberate challenge to the integrity of the guard post, and would be responded to accordingly. The American tourist, still convinced that he was engaged in harmless photography, continued his approach with growing excitement. He raised his camera, preparing to capture the dramatic close-up shots that had occupied his imagination all day. In his mind, he was about to document history. In reality, he was about to become part of it in a way that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Lance Corporal Mitchell's hand moved almost imperceptibly to his sword hilt, a gesture so subtle that Marcus never noticed it. The guard's training was taking over, his body preparing for action while his mind assessed the rapidly developing situation. Years of military discipline had prepared him for this moment, though he had never expected to face such a challenge during ceremonial duty in the heart of London. The confrontation was now inevitable, set in motion by Marcus's fundamental misunderstanding of what he was approaching and Mitchell's unwavering commitment to the duties he had sworn to uphold. Two men from different worlds were about to collide in a moment that would demonstrate the serious consequences of crossing lines that should never be crossed. The moment that would define the rest of Marcus Henderson's life began with a single step too many. As he crossed the final invisible boundary and raised his camera to capture what he believed would be the perfect shot, Lance Corporal James Mitchell's military training took control of the situation with shocking swiftness and overwhelming authority. "Stand back from the Queen's Guard." The command exploded across the courtyard like a cannon blast, delivered in the parade ground voice that Mitchell had perfected during years of military service. The shout was not just loud, it was designed to stop hearts, freeze blood, and instantly command absolute obedience from anyone within hearing range. The volume and authority behind those words could have stopped a charging bull, and they hit Marcus Henderson like a physical blow. The American tourist stumbled backward, his camera nearly slipping from his suddenly nerveless fingers. The transformation of the silent, motionless figure he had been observing all day into a commanding military presence was so complete and so sudden that Marcus's mind struggled to process what was happening. One moment, he had been approaching what seemed like an elaborate statue, and the next he was facing a fully alert combat veteran whose very presence radiated lethal capability. But Mitchell was not finished. With movements that were both precise and terrifying in their controlled violence, the guard spurred his horse forward. Wellington, responding to signals that had been drilled into him through countless hours of training, stepped directly toward Marcus with the kind of measured aggression that suggested this was no mere theatrical display. The massive animal's hooves struck the cobblestones with sounds like gunshots, each step a demonstration of power that could crush a human being with casual ease. The sight of half a ton of trained war horse advancing on him with obvious hostile intent drained all remaining color from Marcus's face. He backpedaled frantically, his carefully planned photography session forgotten in the face of immediate physical threat. The horse's eyes, which had seemed so calm and intelligent from a distance, now held the cold focus of a weapon system engaging its target. Make way for the Queen's Guard. Mitchell's second command was even more forceful than the first, his voice carrying across the entire courtyard and beyond. Tourists scattered like leaves before a hurricane, some screaming in shock, others frantically grabbing for cameras to record what was rapidly becoming an international incident. Parents snatched up small children and fled to safe distances, while teenagers pulled out mobile phones to capture video that would be viewed by millions within hours. Marcus continued his desperate retreat, stumbling over his own feet in his haste to escape the advancing horse and rider. His expensive camera bounced against his chest with each awkward step, but his hands were shaking too badly to maintain a proper grip on the equipment that had gotten him into this situation. The professional composure he had maintained throughout his London vacation was completely shattered, replaced by the primitive fear response of a prey animal facing a predator. The psychological impact of Mitchell's response was as devastating as it was immediate. The guard had transformed from silent sentinel to absolute authority in the space of seconds, demonstrating why the household cavalry had maintained its reputation for discipline and effectiveness across 3 centuries of service. This was not theater or ceremony. This was a real soldier exercising real power in defense of his post. Wellington came to a halt just feet from where Marcus had finally managed to stop his panicked retreat. The horse's massive head towered above the terrified tourist, nostrils flaring as the animal maintained the aggressive posture that his training had taught him to adopt when confronting potential threats. Every muscle in the gelding's powerful body was coiled and ready, waiting for the next signal from his rider. Lance Corporal Mitchell sat motionless in his saddle, but his stillness now carried a completely different meaning than it had moments before. This was not the ceremonial motionlessness of a guard at his post. This was the focused calm of a professional warrior who had assessed a threat and was prepared to respond with whatever level of force the situation might require. His hand remained near his sword, and his eyes, which had been hidden beneath his helmet's visor, now seemed to bore directly through Marcus's soul. The silence that followed was more terrifying than the shouting had been. The entire courtyard had gone quiet except for the sound of Wellington's breathing and the distant click of camera shutters as other tourists documented Marcus's humiliation from what they hoped were safe distances. Even the normal background noise of London traffic seemed muted, as if the city itself was holding its breath to see what would happen next. Marcus stood frozen in place, afraid to move forward, backward, or even sideways. His face burned with shame as he realized that dozens of other tourists were now staring at him, many recording his embarrassment for posterity. The confident marketing executive who had planned this photographic adventure had vanished, replaced by a trembling amateur who had seriously misjudged both his own capabilities and the situation he was attempting to navigate. The guard's response had been perfectly calibrated to achieve maximum psychological impact while avoiding actual violence. Mitchell's training had taught him to escalate force progressively, using the minimum level of aggression necessary to neutralize a threat. The shouting and aggressive positioning had been sufficient to stop Marcus's advance and establish clear dominance, eliminating the need for more serious measures. But the lesson was far from over. Mitchell continued to stare down at the American tourist with the kind of cold assessment that suggested he was memorizing every detail for a future report. This was not just about stopping an inappropriate approach. This was about making sure that Marcus Henderson and every other witness understood exactly what happened to people who failed to show proper respect for British military traditions. Security personnel began to converge on the scene, their radios crackling with reports of the incident. Marcus realized with growing horror that this was not going to be simply a matter of receiving a stern warning and moving on with his vacation. Official procedures were being initiated, and he was about to become the subject of formal security attention that might have consequences extending far beyond his London holiday. A senior officer approached, his uniform indicating rank and authority that made Marcus's situation even more serious. The man's expression was professionally neutral, but there was no mistaking the displeasure behind his calm demeanor. This was someone who had dealt with similar incidents before, and his presence suggested that standard protocols were about to be implemented regardless of Marcus's intentions or embarrassment. "Sir, I need to speak with you about this incident," the security officer said, his voice carrying the kind of polite authority that made refusing cooperation impossible. "Please remain where you are while we sort this out." Marcus nodded mutely, his voice temporarily lost somewhere between shock and shame. He watched helplessly as more officials appeared, each one adding to the growing sense that this incident was being treated with deadly seriousness by people who had the power to make his life very complicated. The casual tourist adventure he had planned was transforming into a bureaucratic nightmare with implications he was only beginning to understand. Lance Corporal Mitchell, his demonstration of authority complete, began the process of returning to his ceremonial position. Wellington backed away from Marcus with the same measured precision he had shown in advancing, every step carefully controlled and purposeful. The horse's demeanor shifted gradually from aggressive alertness back to ceremonial composure, but the message had been delivered with unmistakable clarity. As Mitchell resumed his motionless vigil, the contrast between his current appearance and his previous display of force was almost surreal. The transformation had been so complete and so sudden that witnesses might have doubted their own memories if not for the video evidence being captured by dozens of mobile phones. The guard was once again a silent sentinel, but everyone present now understood that his stillness concealed lethal capability rather than passive decoration. The crowd of tourists maintained a much more respectful distance than they had before the incident. Children who had been playing casually near the horses now stayed close to their parents, and adults approached with obvious caution and careful attention to boundaries that had suddenly become very real rather than merely traditional. Marcus Henderson's mistake had served as an educational experience for everyone present. For Marcus himself, the education was just beginning. As security personnel began the process of documenting the incident and determining appropriate consequences, he realized that his moment of poor judgment was about to have ramifications that would extend far beyond his London vacation. The photos he had hoped to capture were forgotten, replaced by the much more immediate concern of dealing with the serious trouble he had brought upon himself. The American tourist who had started the day as a confident professional documenting his adventure had become a cautionary tale about the importance of respecting boundaries, understanding context, and recognizing when enthusiasm must yield to wisdom. His lesson in humility was being delivered by experts, and the cost of that education was higher than he had ever imagined possible. The formal investigation that followed Marcus Henderson's confrontation with Lance Corporal Mitchell revealed the true scope of what the American tourist had unwittingly triggered. As security officers escorted him to a private office within the Horse Guards building, Marcus began to understand that this incident was being treated as a potential breach of national security rather than a simple case of tourist misbehavior. Chief Inspector Sarah Morrison, a 20-year veteran of the Metropolitan Police who specialized in security incidents involving government facilities, took charge of the situation with the kind of professional thoroughness that made Marcus increasingly nervous. Her questions were precise, methodical, and designed to establish not just what had happened, but why it had happened and whether it represented a larger threat to public safety. "Mr. Henderson," Inspector Morrison began, her voice carrying the neutral tone of someone who had conducted hundreds of similar interviews. "I need you to understand that the Queen's Guard are not ceremonial performers. They are active military personnel responsible for the security of critical government facilities. Your decision to approach Lance Corporal Mitchell's position has triggered protocols that we take very seriously indeed. The small office where the interview was being conducted felt claustrophobic to Marcus, its official atmosphere a stark contrast to the tourist-friendly London he had been experiencing all week. Official photographs of royal family members looked down at him from the walls, and the presence of multiple law enforcement officials made it clear that this was no longer a matter that could be resolved with simple apologies and good intentions. Marcus attempted to explain his reasoning, describing his photographic interests and his admiration for British military traditions. But, with each word, he realized how inadequate his explanations sounded in the face of the serious security concerns his actions had raised. What had seemed like harmless enthusiasm from his perspective was being evaluated through the lens of post-9/11 security protocols that left no room for benefit of the doubt. Sir, Inspector Morrison continued, in the current security environment, any unauthorized approach to a guard position must be treated as a potential threat. The fact that you lingered in the area for several hours, repeatedly photographed the guards, and then deliberately crossed established security perimeters raises questions about your intentions that we need to address thoroughly. The interview process was exhaustive and professionally intimidating. Marcus was questioned about his background, his reasons for visiting London, his knowledge of British security procedures, and his understanding of the role played by the household cavalry. Every detail of his morning activities was scrutinized, from his arrival time to his lunch break to his final decision to approach the guard position. What emerged from this questioning was a picture of an individual who had fundamentally misunderstood both the nature of what he was observing and the significance of the boundaries he had chosen to cross. Marcus's marketing background had taught him to push limits and find unique angles, but those professional instincts had led him into a situation where such approaches were not just inappropriate, but potentially dangerous. The security footage from multiple cameras around Horse Guards Parade provided an objective record of Marcus's activities throughout the day. The investigators could track his movements, observe his extended surveillance of the guards, and document the deliberate nature of his final approach. What Marcus had experienced as a gradual building of confidence appeared on camera as a methodical reconnaissance of security procedures followed by a deliberate challenge to established protocols. Inspector Morrison's team also interviewed other tourists who had witnessed the incident, gathering statements that painted a clear picture of how Marcus's behavior had differed from that of typical visitors. While most tourists approached the guards with obvious respect and maintained appropriate distances, Marcus had exhibited the kind of focused attention and boundary-testing behavior that security professionals were trained to identify as potentially problematic. The consequences of the investigation extended far beyond Marcus's immediate situation. His name was entered into security databases that would flag him for additional scrutiny during any future visits to Britain. His passport information was shared with relevant agencies, ensuring that his poor judgment would follow him for years to come. The incident report would become part of his permanent record, accessible to law enforcement agencies around the world. More immediately, Marcus faced the possibility of criminal charges related to his interference with military personnel performing their duties. British law took such matters seriously, and the prosecutor's office would need to decide whether Marcus's actions warranted formal legal proceedings that could result in fines, imprisonment, or deportation followed by a permanent ban from entering the United Kingdom. The media attention began almost immediately. Video of the confrontation had been uploaded to social media platforms within minutes of its occurrence, and British tabloid newspapers were quick to seize on the story of an American tourist's humiliating encounter with the Queen's Guard. The headlines were uniformly unflattering. Yank learns hard lesson from Horse Guard. Tourist photo op turns into security incident, and American gets royal treatment after crossing the line. Marcus watched in horror as his moment of poor judgment was transformed into international entertainment. The video had been viewed hundreds of thousands of times within hours, with comments ranging from mockery to outright condemnation of his disrespectful behavior. His face was recognizable in the footage, and internet users had already begun identifying him by name and sharing details about his background and employment. The professional consequences became apparent when Marcus's employer in Denver began receiving inquiries from journalists seeking comment on their employees' behavior in London. The marketing firm that employed Marcus prided itself on its international client relationships, and having an employee involved in a widely publicized security incident with British authorities was exactly the kind of negative publicity they could not afford. Back in the investigation room, Inspector Morrison was explaining the broader implications of Marcus's actions. "Mr. Henderson, you need to understand that your behavior has cost the taxpayers a significant amount of money today. Multiple agencies have had to respond to this incident. Security protocols have been activated, and man-hours have been diverted from other important duties. This is not simply a matter of tourist etiquette. This has real costs and consequences." The financial implications were staggering when laid out in detail. The response had involved Metropolitan Police officers, Ministry of Defense security personnel, Horse Guards administrative staff, and various support personnel. The investigation itself would require additional hours of work, documentation, and follow-up. The total cost of Marcus's 30-second approach to the guard position was estimated in the thousands of pounds. Marcus was also informed about the psychological impact of his actions on Lance Corporal Mitchell and the other military personnel involved. These soldiers had been trained to respond to potential threats with appropriate force, and being forced to confront a civilian, even in a non-violent situation, was a source of stress and professional concern. The incident would require debriefing sessions and additional training to ensure that all personnel had processed the event appropriately. The questioning continued for hours, covering every aspect of Marcus's decision-making process and his understanding of British culture and security procedures. The investigators were particularly interested in his claim that he had not understood the seriousness of the boundaries he was crossing, given that multiple warning signs and behavioral cues had been available to guide his conduct. As the interview concluded, Inspector Morrison delivered the verdict that would define the remainder of Marcus's time in Britain. "Mr. Henderson, you will not be facing criminal charges at this time, but you are being issued a formal warning that will remain on your record. You are prohibited from returning to any royal or government facility for the remainder of your visit, and you should understand that any further incidents will result in immediate deportation and a permanent ban from entering the United Kingdom." The relief Marcus felt at avoiding criminal prosecution was tempered by the realization that his London vacation was effectively over. The places he had planned to visit, Buckingham Palace, Windsor Castle, Westminster, were now off-limits. His dream trip had been reduced to shopping districts and museums, with the constant awareness that he was being monitored by authorities who had lost all patience with his presence in their country. As he was finally released from custody, Marcus understood that his education in humility was far from complete. The video of his encounter with Lance Corporal Mitchell would follow him for years, a permanent reminder of the day he learned that some lines should never be crossed, regardless of intentions or enthusiasm. The tourist who had sought the perfect photograph had instead captured the perfect example of how quickly pride can lead to downfall. The aftermath of Marcus Henderson's encounter with Lance Corporal Mitchell extended far beyond the boundaries of Horse Guards parade and continued to unfold long after he had returned to his hotel room that evening. As he sat alone in his cramped London accommodation, scrolling through the increasingly viral video of his humiliation, Marcus began to comprehend the full scope of what his moment of poor judgment had set in motion. The social media reaction was swift and merciless. The hashtag tourist versus guard had begun trending within hours, accompanied by countless memes, reaction videos, and commentary that ranged from educational to brutally mocking. Marcus watched helplessly as his face became synonymous with American tourist arrogance. His 30 seconds of poor decision-making transformed into a global symbol of disrespect and cultural insensitivity. The comments section beneath the viral video painted a picture that Marcus found deeply disturbing. Users from around the world weighed in with opinions about his behavior, American tourists in general, and the broader implications of his actions. While some defended him as simply misguided, the vast majority condemned his approach to the guard as disrespectful, dangerous, and indicative of the entitled attitude that many associated with American travelers abroad. British users were particularly harsh in their criticism, explaining in detailed comments exactly what Marcus had failed to understand about the significance of the Queen's Guard and the seriousness of the boundaries he had crossed. Many pointed out that these were not actors or performers, but real soldiers who had served in combat zones around the world. The ceremonial nature of their duties did not diminish their military authority or their responsibility to maintain security at critical government facilities. Marcus's employer had made the decision to terminate his employment before he had even returned from London. The marketing firm's statement, released to local Denver media, emphasized their commitment to professional conduct and cultural sensitivity in their international business relationships. They could not afford to be associated with an employee whose actions had generated negative publicity on a global scale, particularly when many of their clients had operations in the United Kingdom. The personal cost was equally devastating. Marcus's girlfriend Sarah, who had been excited to hear about his London adventures, was horrified when friends and co-workers began sharing the viral video with her. The man she had been planning to move in with had become an international embarrassment, his face recognizable to millions as the tourist who had learned a hard lesson about British military traditions. Their relationship would not survive the strain of his newfound notoriety. The financial implications continued to mount as Marcus consulted with legal experts about his situation. While he had avoided criminal charges in Britain, the incident had created potential complications for future international travel that would require ongoing legal attention. The cost of managing his damaged reputation and dealing with the professional consequences of his actions would consume the savings he had accumulated for the London trip, and much more besides. Back at Horse Guards Parade, Lance Corporal Mitchell had returned to his duties with the kind of professional focus that had made his response to Marcus's approach so impressively effective. The incident had been thoroughly debriefed, with military supervisors praising his measured use of force and perfect adherence to established protocols. For Mitchell, the confrontation had been simply another example of the kind of situation his training had prepared him to handle. The Guard's commanding officers used the incident as a teaching moment for other members of the household cavalry, emphasizing the importance of maintaining vigilance even during apparently routine ceremonial duties. Marcus Henderson's approach had demonstrated how quickly a normal day could become a security situation requiring immediate and decisive action. The professional response had vindicated years of training and preparation that many might have considered excessive for ceremonial guards. The broader tourism industry began to pay attention to the incident as well. Tour companies started incorporating more detailed briefings about appropriate behavior around British military and royal sites, using Marcus's encounter as a cautionary tale about the serious consequences of crossing established boundaries. The video became part of educational materials designed to help international visitors understand British customs and security protocols. Museums and historical sites throughout London reported increased awareness of boundary issues among American tourists in the weeks following the incident. Guards and security personnel noted that visitors seemed more cautious and respectful, particularly when photographing military or ceremonial personnel. Marcus's humiliation had inadvertently created a valuable teaching moment that benefited future tourists and the professionals responsible for maintaining these important sites. The psychological impact on Marcus himself proved to be the most lasting consequence of his poor decision. The confident marketing executive who had planned to document his London adventure had been replaced by someone who understood, in the most personal way possible, the importance of respecting boundaries and cultural differences. The lesson had come at enormous personal cost, but it had been delivered with unmistakable clarity. Months later, as Marcus struggled to rebuild his career and personal life in Denver, he would often reflect on those crucial moments when his enthusiasm had overcome his judgment. He had learned that some boundaries exist for reasons that go far beyond mere tradition or politeness. They represent fundamental principles of respect, security, and social order that civilized societies depend upon for their stability and function. The incident had also taught him about the power of viral media to transform private moments into public spectacles with consequences that extended far beyond the original participants. His 30 seconds of poor judgment had generated millions of views, thousands of comments, and countless discussions about tourist behavior, cultural sensitivity, and the responsibilities that come with representing one's country while traveling abroad. For Lance Corporal Mitchell, the encounter became part of his service record and a reminder of why his ceremonial duties required the same level of professionalism and readiness he had demonstrated in combat zones. The Guard had shown that tradition and ceremony could coexist with real security responsibilities, and that respect for both was essential for maintaining the integrity of Britain's most important institutions. The Horse Guards building continued to welcome tourists from around the world, but with a renewed understanding of the boundaries that made such access possible. The Guards maintained their vigilant watch, their ceremonial duties undiminished by the knowledge that they were prepared to respond with appropriate force to any challenge to their authority or responsibility. Marcus Henderson's story became a permanent part of internet culture, a cautionary tale that would be shared and discussed for years to come. His quest for the perfect photograph had instead created a perfect example of how quickly confidence can become arrogance, enthusiasm can become disrespect, and a moment of poor judgment can generate consequences that last a lifetime. The tourist who had crossed the line with a royal guard had learned that some lessons can only be taught through experience, and that the most important boundaries are often invisible until it is too late to avoid crossing them. His education in humility had been delivered by experts, and the cost of that education would serve as a reminder for the rest of his life about the importance of wisdom over ambition, respect over entitlement, and careful consideration over impulsive action. The viral video would continue to serve as a teaching tool, ensuring that Marcus Henderson's moment of poor judgment would help countless future travelers understand the serious consequences of failing to show proper respect for the traditions, boundaries, and professional responsibilities that make civilization possible. In the end, his mistake had become everyone's education, though he had paid the highest price for delivering that lesson to the world.